want to welcome everybody. Welcome everybody to this evening's webinar with Dr. Sara Erdner. Sara is going to talk to us about a book that she has put her heart and soul into over the last few years. But I'm not gonna spoil the surprise. A couple of things I just want to kick off with. Last year we started off these webinars dating back into April, and I think Sara, you're number 37. So we're thrilled. We've had lots of really cool presenters, including John Kessel. Many of you know Dr. Ellen Starowski, and one of my colleagues here, Nairi Dardarian, did a three-part series to end the year off with some advice on nutrition. So anyone that's committed to some New Year's resolutions and is 2 weeks into needing some help, there's some good stuff there on our website. So coming up this year, we've got an athlete leadership development workshop coming up in March, and that'll be open to anyone interested. And in a couple of weeks, we've got an interesting discussion from Daniel Freeman talking about the value of sport in the US, particularly in the context of the pandemic. So, Sara, so much of what what the questions that have come in are, what are our athletes thinking? And sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not. And probably more often than not, it's the truth. And you've put a wonderful book together here. So welcome. And why don't you just tell us a little bit about how you got to this point with the book?
Oh gosh, great question. Hi everyone. It's really great to meet some of you all for the first time. So to talk about Dear Coach, I would say this journey started in my master's degree. So I went to University of Tennessee, Knoxville to get my master's in communication studies with a emphasis in interpersonal communication. And when it came to completing my thesis, I obviously had to pick a topic. And I've been an athlete growing up my whole life. I've played a bunch of different sports. And I was really, at the time, very curious about the parent-athlete relationship, where the crazy parents yelling at kids or the really supportive parents. So I did my dissertation on parent communication orientations and how it influenced student-athlete self-efficacy. And that got me connected to sports psychology, which is what I got my Ph.D. in. So to make a longer story short, when I was in my PhD, I was interested in the parent-athlete relationship, but I really was also becoming interested in that triad of the parent-coach-athlete relationship, but understanding that we have to break it down first before we can start getting to the complexity of that. So I looked at the coach-athlete relationship, that also being a very intriguing one to me, and was, to be quite honest with you, when you're a PhD student, you just need to get research done so you can graduate. And so I wanted to interview athletes, but in order to get access to them, it was so much harder to get through IRB, to get because they're more protected than coaches. So I thought, well, let me start out by interviewing coaches, see what their thoughts and perceptions are on how they influence athletes. And again, it was easy for me to get a hold of coaches, just email them, hey, you want to do an interview? And the most saturated response I got, which I talk about this in the book, is that they were like, yo, like it's cool what we think, but we're really interested in what the athletes think. And I was like, yeah, me too. So I really just leaned into the hard. I knew it was going to be a lot more work to get access to athletes, but I thought you have to follow the cookie crumbs. And that's what I was told makes a good scholar, is no matter how hard it is to follow those cookie crumbs, you do that. So I went to my advisor and I said, we need to change my dissertation altogether. And thankfully I had time to do that. It was there was a week time frame where I was able to do that. So I completely rewrote my IRB, resubmitted it to where I was going to interview athletes. And I basically just wanted to know, how does your coach influence your resilience? So I had to couch it within some scientifically supported variables. And resilience to me was very interesting because it was about major stress. And I feel like that's where the coach-athlete relationship really shows itself when stress happens. It really shows whether it's a good relationship or not. And when I sat down, I had a semi-structured interview guide that was influenced by relational cultural theory. It was influenced by a lot of different research. But honestly, I felt like when I sat down, whether virtually or face to face with these athletes, they were just like this untapped oil rig of like, wow, somebody wants to hear our story. And so it went off script heavily. It turned into a phenomenological study. It felt like, where it was just me saying, tell me about your relationship with your coach. And I would probe what they were giving me. And a lot of it was just stuff that they never said. It was stuff they wish they could have said, but never said. So when it came to defending my dissertation, the stories I heard were, I believe, what we can use to help advance sport forward. I by no means in the book, thankfully I had an editor that helped. I will say, when I first started writing this book, I was writing it from a place, there was a lot of anger, justified anger, righteous anger, right? As an athlete, a former athlete myself that's dealt with a lot of things. Um, and so I gathered people around me to help keep me in check of like, yes, how can we rewrite this to call people in instead of calling them out? And so the book definitely has that flavor. And I felt like, and a lot of people, Cam, you would know this too, you do your dissertation, the next step is to go write it as a journal article to get it published so that you can pat yourself on the back as a scholar. And I just felt like that was going to do a disservice to these athletes, their voices. And I felt like they needed to be heard on a larger platform. So I bypassed all of that. I kind of annoyed some people in the process of choosing not to go that route, and started finding publishers for the book. So the book the way it is written is that there is good and there's the not so good. So I reached out after my dissertation to gather letters from athletes, more voices, letting them know about this project I was doing. And I did receive, there's 11 thank you letters in the book that are just as informative as the other not so great letters. So there's a total of 30 letters in the book, mine included. They're all confidential. Mine's a little less confidential because you obviously know it's mine, but it's a collective letter written to all my coaches. So that way it does protect their identity. But as far as the letters in the book, I took out all identifying factors of sport, what level they played at. So there are some professional letters in there from professional athletes, Olympic, college, some of them that are writing to their youth sport coaches. But I took all of that out because those factors didn't really matter, because a lot of the message is the same, which is really that there needs to be a shift in direction. I think a foundational shift, one that isn't just going to happen by us saying, oh, you need to care about the relationship more. There needs to be policies in place. There needs to be a macro level change as well as a micro level change as well. But the book is very much calling coaches in to read these letters. I provide a reflection at the end of each letter for coaches to take from these letters what they need to take from them. And then in part 3, I provide some directions I think we should take. They're not an all-encompassing response. They are more of a, hey, let's start a conversation, which is what I hope to do today with all of you, is really like, I'm here to say, this is one of my things I've created, my art piece, if you will, in the form of a book. But how can we collaborate together to come up with bigger answers, better answers? So, yeah.
Well, having said that, I mean, I think we can make this as informal as we'd like, and anyone that would like to ask any questions, unmute, use the chat. But I think the overwhelming question, Sarah, just to get things rolling, is what would be the and this is a difficult one to distill down, but what would be the couple of pieces of advice you'd give coaches? Because I think the one thing that brings everyone together here is people want to be better at what they do, better coaches, better support of the coaches that they're working with. But from what you've seen, not only in your research but also writing this book, what would you say would be the top couple of pieces of advice you'd give for those that want to be better at what they do?
Yeah, I think one of the big ones I got from athletes, as far as the theme goes, is this concept of the coach and the athlete coaching the athlete. And so really taking the athlete's voice. So you have to, and this differs per level. So again, if you're working with youth athletes that haven't been in the game very long, then they're not going to have a huge knowledge of the sport. So they're heavily going to rely on the coach to really teach them a lot of the technical, tactical, mental. If you're working at the college level, professional, Olympic, I think a lot of coaches forget, and I was with the Pirates for a year, so was really kind of in that uh, process, and I saw a lot of this, not just with the Pirates, but really just in general with coaching. Is it's this dictatorship? It's very much like I'm the coach. Listen to me. We love the concept of complimenting an athlete and calling them coachable. Is really, when we look at that, and a lot of things that came out in the letters, is like, what does that mean? And really what it means is, when I say you're coachable, that means that you shut up, you're quiet, and you just do what I say. And so we're really just teaching athletes to be robots, to be these silent uh, bystanders to the sport, that they're actually their bodies are the ones that are actually playing it. Their bodies are the ones that are performing it. And so why don't we celebrate the fact that they also have knowledge of the sport, right? Like, sit there and say, well, what would you do in this situation? How do you see this going? And teaching them that in those moments to coach themselves. And so I think a lot of what I've ran into being in the environment of sport is there's a lot of ego at play of like, oh, I need to validate and justify my position as a coach. And being a coach means that I always have the answers and I always can give it. And I think there's some validity there. And at the same time, we need to celebrate and praise athletes that they are also really intelligent. They also are very creative in being able to understand training programs. Also, the fact that it's their bodies performing, and so tapping into them coaching themselves so we can better know how what training tables might work for their bodies and what doesn't, and not shaming them to say, well, you're just not cut out for this sport if you don't fit this training program. That's not the case. They are cut out for the sport based on what their body needs. So that's one of them, I think, is this concept of a dual coaching, the athlete and the coach, coaching the athlete, asking more open-ended questions of the athlete when it comes to training times. Another one would be, and I see this a lot in sport, is celebrating their authenticity, who they are. So some examples of this would be, well, let me back up. Every single one of us in this room have a positionality. So I am a white, cisgender, heterosexual female that has a Ph.D. I'm a certified mental performance consultant. I consult with professional athletes. I'm more privileged than not. Like, the only demographic I have knocked against me is that I'm a female. I come from a heterosexual family that's non-divorced with a brother. I'm a dog mom. All these things, we have to understand that our positionality influences how we see the world. And so looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion measures. I was born in the South in a Southern Baptist religion. And so I have to understand that I was taught narratives growing up from my family, from my church, from the sports that I played. Being a woman, that I used to compete in strong woman competitions, which are strongman competitions. So being a woman that was in a very male dominated environment, I heard messages there that influence how I interact with people now. And so an example of this might be that if you grew up in a church, for example, that was like tattoos are wrong and they're a sin, or maybe homosexuality is a sin, then that narrative, if you don't notice it and how it might bias your lens, is going to influence the type of relationship you have with an athlete that either has tattoos or is homosexual. So understanding that we're viewing the world through our own positionality and lens, and being real with ourselves on where our own biases and assumptions lie that are harmful, that are racist, sexist, homophobic, and dealing with those ourselves so that we can come into a more genuine relationship with athletes. And so an example of this as far as coaching goes that I've seen is I've seen a lot of coaches that are very traditional in their views of what it means to be an athlete. So maybe for a men's team, that's making sure your beard is shaved, don't show your tattoos, don't show your jewelry. I can't tell you how many athletes that are men that have been in that situation because the coach thinks that that is what would like makes the team look best. That's what being an adult or professional is. But then they come to see me as a mental performance coach and I'm like, hey, talk to me, what's going on? And they're like, I feel like a child. I feel like this coach is treating me like a parent. I feel like I can't, like, they keep asking me to be a man or to be an adult, but yet I have to shave my beard. Like, I don't like that. It makes me feel like a child. Or, coach keeps making these like slight comments about, having tattoos and how like oh, whatever their bias is, they're imposing it. And it's just making that athlete feel more marginalized. So how can we actually celebrate their differences, right? Maybe it is that they have tattoos and it's like, hey, yo, talk to me about your tattoos. You know, there's probably a meaning behind them, or maybe not, but I would just love to know like why you got them. That'd be neat. So I think it's how can we build sport to be inductive, to where it includes all bodies, rather than trying to deduce an athlete's body to the standard that sport has been founded upon. And so not stripping athletes of their identity, but rather celebrating it. I'll stop there. I have another point I want to make, but I don't want to keep talking so long because I do want this to be a little bit more informal, conversative. Are there any other questions in the group based on what I just said?
I have a million of them, but you got my brains moving. I'm typing over here all these different things.
Wonderful.
But I'm trying to figure out where to start. So, you started to talk about, ego. And one of the things that I was thinking about was, so there's always, and Cam knows this really well, trying to bridge the gap between the educational side and practical, right? So, those, I'm trying to remember what we call them, Cam, I can't remember the term, but we'll figure it out. So from what I'm trying to do is figure out how do you take this? Because I think everybody on here, if you're on this call, you believe in this, you understand that these are high human skills that improve performance, right? So the first question is, is there, how do we take something like your book and the research that you've done and show, is there research out there that shows that there is marked improvement in skills in development of an athlete based on the improved relationships between the coaches and the athletes? So that's kind of the first piece of that puzzle. So do you want to tackle that one first?
Yeah, so Sophia Jowett, that's based out of the UK. Some of you might have been introduced to her work. She is one of the pioneer leading researcher on the coach-athlete relationship. A lot of her research, so she has the coach-athlete questionnaire, which is called the 3 C's plus 1. And I believe, I'm going to butcher this because I didn't just read this before, but it's commitment, complementarity, closeness, and I forget the other one. But there's 4 different C's that go into building a coach-athlete relationship. So for any of you on this call, I would heavily encourage you to look up Sophia Jowett, Jowett work on the coach-athlete relationship. She has quantitative measures that demonstrate that a better coach-athlete relationship, coach-athlete relationship that has a more closeness, and then she has it broken down on what all this means, leads to better outcomes for athlete performance. So there is that research there. Are there any others, Cam, that you can think that I'm leaving out, or anybody else in the group that have ran across something?
I think that's that's probably the best starting point, just in terms of the foundational work there. I mean, Sophia's work, really, I mean, it gets into the concept of power, and I think that's the one thing that you're really speaking to there, Kevin. In terms of your question, but no, I think that's a really good starting point.
Yeah, thank you, Cheryl, too, in the chat for the C stand for closeness, commitment, complementarity, and co-orientation. That was the other one I was looking for. And her work does a really good job of breaking those down. What the heck are they? And then she's looked at different variables on how it increases. Dr. Sakar and Fletcher are the leading researchers out of the UK as well on resilience in sport. And so they have 5 different factors that goes in towards what makes an athlete resilient. And one of them is the coach-athlete relationship. So you can see how we can look at Jowett's work and then go, that's just the coach-athlete relationship, go over here to Sakar and Fletcher's work on resilience and see, boom, the better the relationship you have, it's going to help that athlete feel more supported as they're going through a major stress, helping them be more resilient. So yeah, there is a lot of research that demonstrates. So one of the things I would love to do at a institutional level, an organizational level, NGB level, is how can we, I know so many coaches, and maybe, and that's probably all of you on this call, most people I talk to, that they want to build the coach athlete relationship, but there's no time, because the way it's set up now is like you have this many hours to do the technical and tactical, and then at the end of the day it's like the building the relationship is kind of just seen as like, oh, I might do that in a short meeting on the bus. But how can we shift it to where that's the foundation, that we're encouraging coaches to build that foundation first and then get into the technical, tactical, and building that space to where that's the norm, and doing that from an expectation level for hiring, retaining, and firing, and not just a like, oh, and if you have time, take care of it. Because I think that we're not supporting coaches well enough on that being the expectation of what we're holding them accountable to.
Well, and Sarah, wouldn't you say that, I mean, that's the other piece of the puzzle is using this and using, converting this to, at different levels, even at the collegiate level, the relationship between the parents and the alumni and the administration and the coaches, right? Because, greatest quote that I have from Carrie Fisher is instant gratification takes too long, right? So if you're not winning, you're out. Or if you're a youth coach and you're not winning, I'm going to take my kid somewhere else, right? Or if you're not winning, why are you not putting my kid into, at the collegiate level? So, there's a couple offshoots there. Maybe that's not happening at the Olympic level or the professional level necessarily, but, you've got the Monday morning quarterbacks and things like that. So this is the hardest thing. This is, pushing that boulder up a hill is, we're all pushing, right? Because we understand this and we believe it. How do you get the pull from all these other critical positions within, whether it's an organization or a community or an an institution?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the things I encourage in my book specifically is in part 3, I actually encourage coaches to write their own Dear Coach letter, because most coaches are former athletes. And then I actually transition into saying, this book isn't necessarily here to call coaches out. It's really calling them in. And one of those calling in is to write a letter, what I call a Dear Sport letter, but maybe it's a letter that you write to your sport administrators. That's advocating for your needs, that's saying, hey, I'm also looking at my win-loss record here. I see, you don't have to tell me maybe that I have more of a loss, or maybe I'm on the chopping block here or whatever, and this is what the, research shows. The relationship, building that relationship is actually what's going to lead to a better team cohesion, more resilient athletes, all these things maybe that tie into the mission of the university, of the organization, professionally, olympically. Can we have a conversation about how maybe I rework the hours that I'm allowed to see these athletes, right? At the NCAA level, you're only allowed to be with them a certain amount of time. Professionally, that's different. Olympically, that's different. But not being scared as a coach, because what I think has happened is it's cyclical. Athletes have been taught that you need to be coachable, shut up and listen to what the coach tells you and just be a robot. And then those athletes become coaches, and those coaches behave the same way towards sport administrators. It's almost as if they take on that athlete role as a coach toward those that are in power over them, so they don't feel empowered or encouraged to go speak to the sport administrator to say, this is what I need, and this is the change that needs to happen. So I think that's step one, is asking, hey, would you support me in this? If the answer is no, then I think that is cause for questioning, like, are you in a space that you should be in, a place that should support you the best way for you to build the relationships that you need?
Does that lead itself into the whole thing we were talking about before about the uncertainty management? Because if you don't have that relationship to ask without repercussion, then you don't have a position.
Well, and then also, if you as the coach are humbly approaching a sport administrator, asking them, hey, I would love to organize my team this way, and they're not giving you the autonomy to do that, or they're being like, yeah, that just seems too fluffy. that coach is actually enacting the behavior that they should want the athlete to enact in them. And so it's going to actually build empathy for the coach toward the athlete when the athlete approaches them, right? The coach is going to be like, wow, I was in this position with my sport administrator. I understand the courage it takes to come to me. And so it's really teaching coaches to live the life. If we truly want to empower coaches, then coaches need to empower themselves to advocate for themselves. And also people like me advocating for coaches. There's some things I talk about in the book on coach mental health initiatives. We have so many initiatives that goes towards athletes, mental performance, mental health, all these things. And I'm like, there's something called mirror neurons in our brain. We mimic the behavior we're around, and you're around your coach a lot as an athlete. And so if you have a mentally unhealthy coach, all that money in mental health initiatives and mental performance initiatives is really just being thrown like down the drain because we don't have mentally healthy coaches. So
I think that connects to some extent, Sarah, with a question that came in about what happens when you see an athlete going in the wrong direction, whether their behavior has already crossed the line, and that coach can see it. How from the book, from your experience, from your research, what are your insights on that one?
Yeah, that's such a great question. My number one thing is communicating and starting a conversation, which is how I wrote this book. I simply want to start a conversation similar to what we're doing. And I think for a coach, very simply to just call the athlete in, hey, I'm noticing these things. Maybe I'm a little worried about you. I see this direction you're going in, but I would love to know your perspective, right? Because maybe their perspective isn't that they're going in the wrong direction. Now, depending upon that direction and the rules and of NCAA, maybe, right? It depends on the situation, having that hard conversation with the athlete of, okay, you obviously have a choice to go in the direction you want. However, if you continue going that direction, it might be in direct contrast to what we need to uphold here. And so if you choose that direction, it's going to lead me to have to, either release you from the team. So that could be one outcome. But I think just calling the athlete in and creating that safe space of saying, hey, I would love to know your perspective, and allowing them to speak. Again, there's a great article in the New York Times about calling people in rather than calling them out. And it's all about just saying, hey, I want to call you in and have a conversation. Because from your perspective, you might say, yo, this behavior is just, no, like you're out. But that's not fair, because that's your biasing and assumption and your positionality influencing how you're perceiving the situation. Instead, how can you use that situation to build the relationship instead of terminate it?
I think, it brings up an interesting one with professional sport where, some of your superstar athletes are being paid multiple times more than the actual coach. And so, in that context, where you may say the superstar superstar athlete has more leverage than the coach. What are some insights on that one?
Gosh, I actually rewatched The Last Dance recently with Michael Jordan, and I think about my favorite athlete, Dennis Rodman. I just think that he's crazy. He does stuff that I wouldn't do, but I just love how much he is so unapologetically him. And I feel like Phil Jackson, there's a episode on there where he talks about how he met Dennis Rodman where he was at. And he was like, yo, none of them really liked it. They didn't like the fact that he needed 48 hours to go to Las Vegas to go gamble. And then Michael Jordan was like, he's not coming back. But Phil was just like, yeah, but we have to let him breathe, And I remember I could feel myself getting anxious during that episode, because I was like, I would never do that. I would never give him that leverage. But I think Phil Jackson does such a great job of just understanding what an athlete needs. And it talks about in that episode how he went to Vegas, he did his thing. They even had to go and get him. They had to go fly to bring him back after the 48 hours. But then he came back and he crushed. And so I think that's what we have to understand is sometimes we don't understand an athlete, and we never will, but constantly thinking, what do they need? And willing to hear them out instead of saying, wow, that's just too absurd. And Phil Jackson it seems like he never really said that to any athlete. He never said, your request is too absurd. It was more of a, okay, let's talk about this. right? And he negotiated with him. I think he wanted to go for a week, and he was like, no, 48 hours. Obviously he didn't. Professional sport is a little bit differently. You're dealing with professional athletes, you're dealing with people that are getting paid. This is their job, so you have a little bit less control per se. So yeah, there's some politics there, but I think that would be, if anybody hasn't watched that would be something I would encourage you to watch.
Yeah, look, but I also think we touched on administrators, and I think we'll come back to that for a little bit, but also the concept of the parent, the overbearing parent that sort of, whether they did it in their time or thought they did it in their time or wanted to do it in their time, and they're playing, vicariously through their kids. But that, how about managing that dynamic of the coach being able to not only facilitate the conversation with the athlete or the players, but also with the broader community. And I think parents is, you touched on that a little bit. Do you want to just speak a little bit to that as well?
Oh yeah. And I'll say this first, like I'm still researching this because I'm still very curious about this triad relationship. And so again, I broke it down, like, let's look at coach athlete. I looked at parent athlete, and I have some other book projects already in the works. So hopefully those will kind of come out and give more information. But one of the things with my master's thesis was that I interviewed, or I sent out, it was a quantitative research. So I sent out questionnaires to athletes, and the results showed that athletes who had parents who had a unidirectional form of communication, and what that means is a very controlling parent, my way or the highway, you have to do it this way, the ones that are yelling at them in the car after the game, those parents had there was a huge decrease in the athlete's self-efficacy to perform the task of their particular sport. The parents, on the other hand, that were what are called conversationalist parents, those that are wanting to have a conversation with their athlete, they ask open-ended questions. How was that game for you? Like, how do you feel about it? And really invited them in. They had, the effect was that there was a higher increase in self-efficacy for those athletes. So one of the things that can be done is that coaches can take that information, and I can send that article to anybody who's would like it. They can take that information and have a meeting with the parents at the very beginning of the season, and just disseminate that information to them and let them know, like, this is research that's been shown. Maybe even just I'm big on conversations, similar to how conversational parents have a better increase in athlete self-efficacy. Coaches that are more open, willing to have conversation with athletes have a better influence on the coach-athlete relationship, which then influences optimal performance. Having that same open conversation with parents, bringing them in, hey, you're vital here, telling them that, right? Instead of this whole like, nope, you have no, trying to push them out, call them out. I think call them in, hey, like, let's discuss this. Where are you at? What are you seeing, right? Develop a relationship with them, but also have boundaries. And I think that's a big thing for coaches. Have those boundaries set. This is what I expect, and then them agreeing to that. And it could be something as simple as having a contract that the parents sign, an informal one, if you will, where they agree to it. Maybe having a contract that these are the non-negotiables I have set, but I'm willing to have a conversation with the group on building other boundaries, right? And then the coach can sit there and say, yeah, I'm willing to work with that. Again, this differs per level because professional is different than college, is different than youth and Olympic. So.
Yes, I think that's such an interesting discussion, of the differences, and in so many ways, coaching is coaching, and I think so many of the lessons that we all share is maybe not the good ones, maybe not even the truth, but that one athlete that one time you wish you knew what they were thinking, but you really don't, and you sort of want to get rid of it and go to bed that night and not think about it. Of those not so good letters, which one stood out for you as one where you were in the situation, you resonate with the situation, but just that one moment where you wish you could have done it differently?
Well, one of the not so great letters that just comes to mind immediately, and gosh, there's so many of them that resonate with me, is the last letter of part 2 with an athlete who dealt with an eating disorder that started by a comment a coach made to them. And it's such a powerful letter because this particular athlete speaks out on how it was this snowball effect where the way that sport is even built is that one of the things I heard growing up I was a triathlete for a while, so we heard less mass go fast. So something as simple as that, you think, okay, I need to get smaller, and compound upon that I'm a female, right? So there's the intersectionality going on. But to me, with that letter, it was not necessarily calling, it wasn't necessarily calling the coach out. It was trying to call the coach in, because this particular athlete said, this is an issue with the system. There's no accountability in place, or even education for that matter, that teaches at coaches not to be more aware of the things that they say. To not make that comment at dinner about, oh, you're going to eat all of that, which was the spiral that started the downward effect. And then that letter was very eye-opening, because the first year that athlete was working with the coach, they had the eating disorder. They were performing phenomenally. And so they were getting positive praise. And while the coach wasn't necessarily directly praising the eating disorder, they were indirectly praising it. And so it was reinforcing this eating disorder. So then when the second year rolled around, again, the eating disorder catches up with you, just as any type of disordered behavior does. And so then it turned into the coach getting mad at this athlete of, well, why aren't you performing well? Well, it's because they became so weak, their bones were becoming brittle. And then it became just this mental illness of like, hold on, wait, you were praising me for doing this, and I'm still doing it. And then now all of a sudden I'm not being praised. And so it was causing a lot of mental health, mental performance issues. But then the athlete came reading between the lines, is like, this isn't really your fault. There's nothing in place that holds coaches accountable to a standard or teaches them otherwise. Because what we have right now is athletes turn coaches. And there's really there's an encouragement of education, and maybe some I know soccer is a little bit different in their education program, but there's nothing there that really is teaching coaches about coaching pedagogies. They just get thrown into it, and then they end up coaching like they were coached. And so my heart goes out to coaches, because I think there's a lot of them that are like, I don't really want to coach this way, but I don't know how else to do it. And I don't have time to do it. And so that's really where I want to come in and be like, okay, we need to make some time. Like, why are schedules the way that they are? Why is this, why do we have to practice as much as we practice? How have we gotten to where we're at today? So.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to unpack there. Whether it's coach wellness, coach education and development. I do want to sort of circle back a little bit to administration, because I think so much of what the challenges that coaches face land on what the expectations of the admin will be. If it's a straight, you'll stick around if you're winning. If you're losing, you're out. Kind of parameters, particularly as they're supported by the resources. And I know Kevin and I, there's a bunch of us that have talked about, well, you can set the targets, you can be really clear about the outcomes and how to get about it. But if the resources aren't there, we do have a number of administrators that are either on the call or will listen to this recording. What's some advice there in terms of that conversation of setting the culture, setting the expectations, so that there aren't those sort of hard edges on get over 500 and you're in, or make the playoffs, or win the championship, and we'll see you next year. Otherwise, find another job.
Yeah, no, wonderful. Two things. One of them being similar to what I've said, have the conversation, call the coach in. What do you need from me? How can I help you? How can I add value to what you're doing? I think being willing to, because as the person in power, it's going to take so much more courage and energy of a coach to approach you and ask, for what you need, rather than if the sport administrator just started that conversation at first. Like, hey, let me bring you in, let's chit chat. What do you need? Secondly, we have to understand, I think culture is a buzzword we like to throw around. We also like to throw around the word family, where we say like, oh, we're a family. Well, first, we have to understand that for some people, that's a triggering word. Some people were not raised in families that are great. And so to call it a family, you're asking an athlete, so working in a professional baseball environment, with the Latin population that's coming from, and even the American population, that I had an athlete one day have an absolute breakdown, hyperventilating breakdown. That was an American athlete. Turns out that they were adopted very young, and they just had a panic attack one day that their parents weren't answering the phone. Their adoptive parents weren't answering the phone, and they thought that they were just gonna, the moment they turned 18, they were just gonna get rid of them. And so we have to understand that family is a word that I think we throw around so often, but we're dealing with athletes that don't come from great families. And so to use it is actually more harmful than good. And we have to understand that when using the word family and culture, that we so often as coaches, and I can understand this, we like to say, this is the culture of this team. And any athlete that comes in has to deduce their bodies to this culture that I, as the coach, have created. And here are our 5 rules, or our 5 whatever commandments. But culture is going to change anytime you add or subtract an athlete, because the bodies of the team make the culture. And so the culture will change every single year. And so it's best for a coach to actually be more open, flexible, to be like, okay, let's have this conversation as a team. To talk about, what culture do we want to be a part of? What does culture mean to you? What does family mean to you? And then make that culture specific for that year. So for sport administrators, the same thing with coaches. And this, I mean, I graduated from University of Tennessee. We know what's happening in the news. Jeremy Pruitt is out. Like there's so much movement. Professional sport, oh my gosh, like you're on a year contract. Like you're either in or you're out. Your athletes are released for no reason. You could have had an all-star game, their all-star season the day before, the year before, and then you're out. It's culture is ebbing and flowing so much based on the different levels. But for sport administrators to realize that it's not about saying this is this organization's culture, so you have to fit to it. It's having those conversations to say, what do you need from me? And in those conversations, dictating the culture. Thus, it's going to change every year in a flexible, fluid way.
So Sarah, though, wouldn't you, I mean, at some point you have to have some non-negotiables that you believe in, right? Because if your team doesn't match, if you coaching your team, if you have your why, if you know what your goal, your fundamental values are, I know it's hard, you can't just push them on somebody, but if there are certain things that are, we're not going to trash talk, we're not going to celebrate like crazy after a goal, or personally, I go nuts when I see the NFL players go into the screen to celebrate. It's like, it's your job. Get on to the next play, especially if you're losing, but those are things that, because I feel that, from my standpoint as a coach, it's brash, do you want it coming back in your face, take the high road, things like that. So where's that balance? Yeah, I absolutely believe in having those conversations, but if what your team is saying doesn't match your beliefs, then there's going to be conflict right away. So how do you got to walk a fine line with that?
Yeah, I would challenge you to ask, how do you define the high road, and understand that an athlete might not define that high road the same way. And so you're deducing a human body into your way of doing things. And so bringing it back to Dennis Rodman, I think if he would have had, Phil Jackson, all of them were like, we would not do this. This is not the high road per se, but understanding that in order for him to thrive, he needed to do what he needed to do, and giving him a little bit of that rope. I do think that there needs, I'm not against non-negotiables, but I think that having flexibility, understanding that every single person is, so for example, you might think an NFL, NHL player coming to the camera to do what they do is really brash. Well, that's also a very subjective evaluation of that athlete, because they might actually, that might evoke a very like primal feeling in them, and that primal feeling is something that they need to optimally perform. And so it's constantly, and this is something I have to do even as a teacher, is I had to have the hard conversation with myself, especially this last semester, on what do I think it means to be a good student? And I started realizing that I was judging these students' bodies themselves based on how they were performing. And that wasn't fair to them. And I was actually not being inclusive. I was being exclusive based on that, because I was judging them based on what I thought meant to be a good student, which basically was judging them based on how I was as a student. And so, yeah, I would challenge that just a little bit, but I do think that maybe coming together as a team and saying, what are our non-negotiables? And maybe throwing out as a coach, saying, here's a couple that I've had in the past. I'm willing to like talk about this. You know, these are things that I think will create a safe environment. You know, maybe it is like having communication that is safe. And then making sure that they have input on it as well.
Awesome. Francisco, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Just a quick question. You're talking about basically communication and feedback, right? Just trying to figure out what the student, what the athlete wants from their coaches, and what their coaches would want from their students or athletes. But at the same time, you talk about the time issue, the time constraint, that there's not enough time to do all this. Ideally, you create that bond with your peers or with your coaches or with your students with one-on-one communication. We might not have that availability for everybody. So how do you go about creating that safe space in a group where people might feel comfortable sharing and being vulnerable and talking about their inner thoughts in a group setting, because that might be all you get, instead of that one-on-one conversation.
For sure. Great question. I speak about in the book that modeling is huge. And so as a coach, it's very important to, and I'll give an example of this with a team I worked with. They won the national title for their league 3 years in a row. And then they were actually in the title game for the 4th year, and then they ended up losing. And so I asked those athletes, I was like, what? Like, they were kind of this scrappy team. When they got to the championship game, they're like, we don't really know how we got here. It's like, okay, there has to be something with this. And one of the athletes was telling me that there was a very profound moment for them when the coach at the very beginning of the season, and they also did this exact same thing right before the championship game, they thought he was just going to walk in and say, okay, this year we're going to do X, Y, and Z, and these are our goals, blah, blah, blah. But he actually walked in and started talking about his life as an athlete, sharing about his family, introducing them to his kids, just being vulnerable, talking about himself as a coach and also as not a coach. Shared some mistakes that he made as a coach previously, talked about the lessons that he learned and how he sat there and promised those athletes that he made those mistakes. There's nothing you can do, but he promised he wouldn't make those same mistakes again. And he also asked them that while he would be diligent to not disrespect them as human beings, that he was a very self-aware person, that if he did unintentionally harm one of them, that he would own up to it. And he promised them that. He said, I promise I'm not going to make the same mistakes again, but that doesn't mean I'm not going to make the same mistakes moving forward. And the whole meeting had a very humanistic feel, right? It's like, it was less about like, okay, welcome to this team. This is how we are. These are the rules. He just was real. And then the athletes ended up saying, then he opened it up and he said, I would love, is there anything anybody, would like to bring to the group? And one athlete would stand up and be like, yes, I just want to thank you. Like, I also have made these mistakes in the past as an athlete, and just started opening up. And then the next thing you know, this 30-minute meeting actually turned into like an hour and a half, 2-hour meeting, which again, you might not have that time, but it just shows that when the coach opened up to be vulnerable with them and say, hey, like, I noticed my downfalls. This is what I promised to you. And I also promised that if I do hurt you, I want you to know that I care to hear what you say. If I ever do harm you, you're welcome to come to me and we can have the conversation. And so that doing that in a group meeting and their team, the team cohesion on that team was so, no team could beat them, because they were just like, when we went to the plate, I was batting for my family. Like we were there. And so I think that I wanted to share that story as a very powerful one that I hope is sticky. Of this coach didn't go in with the let's talk technical tactical. He went in very humble of, this is my heart and I want to show it to you, and I invite you to show your heart to me. And that if it nothing else, even if we don't win games, at least we have a heart connection. And then you see the byproduct is that they did win games. So that's what I would suggest doing, is very much just being walk into rooms with athletes in a very humble stance, owning up to what you need to own up to. Another letter that sticks out from the book is a coach that was dealing with their partner had cancer. And instead of trying to hide it and act like everything was fine, they actually opened up to the athletes and were able to say, like, yo, I'm going through this. Like, this is hard. And the athletes were like, wow, coach, thank you so much for sharing that with us. We know this is hard. We're here for you. So that's what I would suggest in group settings, to get the most bang for your buck, if you will, given that time is an issue. It is. And that's something I hope in the long run that we can change, to where you can get those one-on-one interactions.
Oh, Sarah, so much good stuff. Great question, Francisco. And I did want to acknowledge Cheryl posted some great resources there from PCA. I also wanted just to add something here from Project Play, because I think they've got another inventory tool which I think is quite useful for programs are sort of just trying to get a feel for where to go from a directional perspective. But I think, Sarah, my last question, knowing time's the hour has flown by, in terms of role modeling and sort of reducing the barriers to our sport, I think that's one of the major takeaways for me from the book, that you speak from such authenticity, and the letters really speak really from the heart. So, we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion today, very unlike what we did 12 months ago. And that, I hope, is something that we're all finding ways to thread through everything that we do. But that's my sort of last question of reducing the barriers to our sports, not only for players and athletes, coaches, administrators, and the like. But what's your sort of last message there, and just in terms of that topic of diversity, equity, inclusion, and moving forward with the power of what we do?
Yeah, in order to not repeat history, we have to look at history, and we have to look at it in a very truthful way, and that's going to hurt. And we have to understand that sport was built by white, middle-class, able-bodied men to produce better white, male, middle-class, able-bodied men. Historically, sport was built to prepare men for war and to indoctrinate European bodies into the American way, white, male, middle-class, able-bodied American way. And so then when Title IX came in as an example to give access, female, basically not discriminate, give access to people's bodies that were not white men, we never really questioned what sport was built upon. We just asked women to deduce their bodies into male sport. We asked the gay community to deduce their bodies into heterosexual normative sport. And so that's where we get today, where we are not looking at the hard truths of how sport was built. And so one of my main goals is, how can we, instead of deducing bodies into what sport has told us those bodies should be, how can we be inclusive? How can we be inducive of those bodies? And that is a very big, that's a project. That's not something that's going to happen tomorrow, but it's going to happen one by one by having conversations, by opening up a part of somebody's brain and saying, yeah, I didn't even notice that, right? Let me see how I can look and be this way. And that's why it's so important to have the conversations. If you're a male coach coaching a female team, how can you ask, like, hey, talk to me? One thing that we don't talk about is as women, we have periods, and those periods affect performance, right? Like, let's normalize that. How can we actually use the menstrual cycle to work for us when doing training tables, rather than saying, you're just going to have to get over the fact that you're cramping right now and you're losing blood, again, deduce your female body into male sport. And so it's having those conversations and having people see it differently so that we can start to rewrite the foundation from which sport was built upon. And I'll leave with this, because we need to understand that sport is a microcosm of the larger society. And so what we see happening globally, what we see happening to Black bodies, to gay bodies, is happening in sport. It's just, it looks a different way. It's being masked in a different way on different playing fields.
So good, Sarah. So much more that we could and will talk about. I'm going to add the link here to the Amazon to the Dear Coach link.
Well, and I will do, there's the Amazon, so that's for pre-order. That doesn't come out until June 22nd. This order form I'm putting on here now, if you all actually would like an advanced reader copy, which I'm the only one that has access to those. You can order it, and I can send you an advanced reader. It will be signed. I'll put like a nice little note in there for you. But if you do just want to go on Amazon and you don't want to like interact with me, that will become available June 22nd, 2021. The ebook will actually come available March 2nd, 2021. So there's a little time, but there is obviously, if you want to get your hands on it sooner rather than later, you can go to that Google form and I can get that shipped out to you.
Awesome. Well, Sarah, thank you so much. I think what you've shared is just a little taste of what I know many of us will be integrating, not only just to share with other coaches, but as curriculum. So thank you so much. Thanks everyone for joining us. And we will have a recording posted so that you can share this with anyone that you would like. Sarah's dropped in her email there. And if anyone has any questions, let me know and we can forward them to Sarah. So
yeah, please email me if you want to do some side chat. So
very good. Thanks everybody.
Thank you, everyone.